Donkey Kong. He's been many things over the course of his lifetime. A villain, a hero, even a rhythm game mascot. What even is this? From a puzzle platformer to a side-scroller into a 3D collectathon, the Big Ape has seen many experimental titles come and go over his 40 years as a piece of gaming history. Now, everyone knows the country games, with their arguably being his most iconic appearance being a critical and commercial success during the 90s. Being made by Rareware, the British developers basically had to completely reinvent the brand to appeal to audiences at the time after the series went pretty much dormant for over a decade after its arcade presence. Rare was introducing their own characters, lore, and even the way the game was being played, with it being a 2D side-scroller. The series was at the cutting edge at the time of its release, with it also being a graphical powerhouse back in 1994. Sadly, we all know how this story ended, with the Microsoft buyout forcing Rare to step away from developing Donkey Kong games and instead making Xbox exclusive titles like these. Anyway, Nintendo was once again in charge of its own IP after losing a talented group of developers who pretty much spearheaded the series over the last decade. Enter the Nintendo GameCube, a true powerhouse of a machine during the 6th generation of consoles. This was arguably the most experimental period in Nintendo's history as game developers. Every series pretty much had some kind of bold new direction which played around with traditions and pre-established ways that those games were known for. Double Dash gave us 2 races, Kirby Air Ride was a strange experimental kart racer where you played using just one button, Metroid Prime did the impossible, transitioning the series into 3D, and the Wind Waker looked like this. When it came to Donkey Kong, Nintendo wanted to maintain its beloved IP's popularity whilst taking it into a new direction since Rare was no longer around. And in celebration of the Big Ape finally getting a new release after 11 years with Donkey Kong Bonanza, I thought what better way to celebrate the occasion than with a look back at a more forgotten entry from the series' rich history with Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. Nintendo answered fans back in 2004 looking for a new DK title. But were they going to follow through with the solid and beloved formula that Rareware had laid down the foundation for before they left, or would they do their own thing and push the series into a whole new direction? Well, they kinda did both. Starting off, Jungle Beat is a very unconventional platforming game. Have you ever played Mischief Makers before on the N64? No? Well, similar to that title, Jungle Beat is more physics based, having you jumping around and performing combos in the air for points. There's also a bigger focus on combat here, unlike the country games. You gain points for a combo by collecting bananas and attacking enemies, which also reminded me of Shaking in Mischief Makers. Anyway, this central mechanic is an interesting one and encourages player expression. It takes some getting used to at first, but once you start connecting these motions together, you'll be racking up plenty of points and it feels satisfying to pull off as you master its mechanics. At the end of each level, there's a boss fight, and the points that you've collected throughout the previous stages is then turned into DK's health. When finishing a fight, depending on how many hits you took, your score will be affected, which totals in your rank once you've beaten the boss. It's a clever mechanic that actually gives your points meaning for once in a game and kind of adds a level of dynamic difficulty to Jungle Beat. If you feel confident enough, you can breeze through levels and go for the boss without taking a single hit, but of course you will be making things harder for yourself. However, if you want to play it safe before a boss, you can stock up on points to ensure that you have plenty of health beforehand. Anyway, the boss fights themselves are actually pretty great and even rival some of the country games in this aspect. There's this one punch-out style boss fight where you have to dodge attacks and punish accordingly, which is a nice change of pace from the main gameplay. There's a good amount of variety here, with some being more focused on platforming and relying on your reflexes. Also, something about these boss fights really stood out to me whilst playing. They look stellar. Shout outs to Ninja Kong, by the way, a personal favourite of mine. So you may be wondering, what's the story here? Why is Donkey Kong fighting these demonic looking primates to begin with? What actually possesses him to go ham and wail away at every enemy he sees, showcasing a level of strength and unhingedness that no other Nintendo game has displayed before? Well, unfortunately, no one knows. This game has no story at all. The only thing that remotely resembles a narrative is mentioned in a throwaway text box is that you want to become king of the jungle for some reason, and that's what you do, I guess. Why? No idea. This is when you start to see the significant differences between how Rare and Nintendo went about making a 2D platformer with Donkey Kong. Even though all Rare used was a small 10-second cutscene, the country games were great at giving you some kind of narrative reason to keep going and see things through to the end. They weren't exactly pinnacles of storytelling, but the characters and levels went a long way in communicating some kind of narrative that complemented the experience. Especially in Country 2 Diddy's Conquest with the whole shipyard aesthetic. Anyway, Jungle Beat was kind of the beginning of a trend that really started to annoy fans when it came to Nintendo. You know, that well-known Miyamoto style of not having any story whatsoever, gameplay is the sole focus and nothing else. All the levels in Jungle Beat feel completely disconnected from one another with no plot to tie it all together like in the Country games. This issue will become much bigger in titles such as Mario Galaxy 2 and the infamous Paper Mario Sticker Star, which needless to say is a story that pretty much every Nintendo fan has heard a million times at this point. It is a shame though, there's all these interesting character designs and set pieces with no actual narrative or continuity to tie it all together. It all feels really disconnected. No one even talks outside of the hints from these awful looking helper monkeys. I really don't like how they look, by the way. Anyway, Jungle Beat is a good example of how even a small, more trivial plot like getting your bananas back, saving a princess, or beating some kind of evil entity or force is way better than, well, nothing. I can understand that this is a more personal preference and that many people online agree that most games don't even need stories to begin with. But for me personally, I find that it only ever adds to an experience opposed from taking away from it. But you know, whilst the story and characters are non-existent in Jungle Beat, its personality still shines in many other ways. First up is the presentation for this game. Despite being a late GameCube release, Jungle Beat is aged incredibly well visually, like many titles on the system. Donkey Kong himself is very expressive and exaggerated. There's also the impressive use of fur texture used on the enemies and DK. The game's movement and controls is another unique aspect to Jungle Beat. Originally on the GameCube, you move Donkey Kong using the bongo drum controller. The later Wii revision of the game uses the Wii remote and nunchuck and has added widescreen support, which is what I used in this footage. I know that motion controls are accepted a little more nowadays compared to back in 2009, but when playing Jungle Beat today I found them to be very satisfying, especially when punching enemies or grabbing multiple bananas in the air. Donkey Kong's movement in this game feels very smooth and responsive in general. Come to think of it, this is the most Mario Donkey Kong has ever felt. He can perform maneuvers that you typically associate with Mario, such as how you can crouch or do a backflip. You can even grab ledges and perform his staple ground pound maneuver with this similar looking move. In all honesty, it wouldn't surprise me at all if at some point this game once began development as a Mario title. Speaking of, the most well-known fact about Jungle Beat is how a lot of its ideas and concepts would later be implemented in Mario Galaxy a few years later. This is since it was made by the same in-house development team, which kind of explains why the whole movement feels so similar. Some set pieces in Galaxy, such as these flowers which appear in Gusty Gardens, are lifted straight from Jungle Beat. You also have the pseudo-physics style platforming, the bubble sections, as well as the use of ricocheting projectiles. There's just something quite poetic about these comparisons, since it looks like with Donkey Kong Bonanza, similar similarities, concepts and ideas will be taken from Mario Odyssey since it's being made by the same developers. These two series really have come a long way since their arcade debut. Moving on, another aspect I found interesting about Jungle Beat is how Nintendo went about characterizing the ape himself. Previously, he's been depicted by Nintendo as a bumbling villain like in Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy. Rareware characterized him as a more standard get things done hero protagonist. But with Jungle Beat, there's more of a heavy focus on DK's brute force here, his more animal side with his raw strength. Rareware reserved that role for other members of the DK crew, but with how Nintendo axed every pre-established bit of world building Rareware previously created, Jungle Beat in many ways feels like a soft reboot for the character. Which in retrospect was probably for the best back in 2004, since DK the character was kinda going for an identity crisis at the time with all these games and spin-off titles depicting him in different ways. Jungle Beat really showcases the big ape's strength in this title. He can punch out enemies, headbutt to break giant eggs and give bosses the beatdown. I kinda prefer this more unhinged and destructive DK compared to Rare's, to be honest. It seems like with Bonanza, Nintendo is taking more notes from Jungle Beat since there is a heavy focus on destroying environments in that game. When playing Jungle Beat today, I feel like it also maintains the series tradition of being pretty challenging. It still doesn't get nowhere near as difficult as the first two Country games, but compared to the return titles, I'd say it's on par in terms of the challenge showcased in those games. It's no slouch however, especially in the later levels where you have to rely on your reflexes in the literal sense to clap back on enemies before they can get the hit on you. In general, I don't really have any major complaints when it comes to Jungle Beat. Sure, some of the level backgrounds can look generic, and I've already mentioned how I hate these helper monkey designs. But I will say, some of the level gimmicks similar to Mario Galaxy can be hit or miss, and the level select UI is pretty dated and uninspired. In particular, the bubble and bird flying sections can feel a bit too sensitive to control. The game does also reuse boss fights, but I found that they were different enough on the second time around to where this didn't really bother me, and I'm already a big fan of them to begin with. The game is also really short, even by 2D platforming standards, but that's another aspect that's pretty understandable. I mean, I doubt Nintendo wanted a long experience of you banging the bongos or shaking your wrist too much. It's a very short and sweet game where no idea or gimmick overstates its welcome. When looking at the legacy of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, things are kinda strange. You'd think an IP of this caliber would resonate with fans, but according to interviews online, Nintendo representatives said it sold poorly, with it selling just over 1 million copies on the GameCube and less than 1 million on the Wii. Which is a bit odd since the original game had to be played with the bongo controllers and was released on a system that had an install base that was nothing when compared to the Wii's. I feel like Jungle Beat has gone somewhat forgotten by Nintendo and its fans when talking about the series today. Whenever you hear about Donkey Kong's past, it's usually referring to the country titles or maybe the arcade games. Even when mentioning the bongo controls, most people tend to bring up Donkey Konga for its sheer weirdness over Jungle Beat. I also just don't think the name does it any favours either. Jungle Beat sounds like a generic rhythm game title and not a fully fleshed high quality 2D platformer made by Nintendo, which probably didn't do it any favours back in the day. After Jungle Beat's release, it wouldn't be long until Retro Studios picked up the torch in 2010 with the Country Returns games, bringing the series back to what fans probably wanted back in 2004 when Jungle Beat came out. That kinda brings us into the modern day. After Tropical Freeze's release, nothing really happened for 11 years in the series outside the key role being added into Smash Ultimate. Jungle Beat in the modern day has pretty much fallen into obscurity for the most part, with the game itself also being stuck on old hardware. And even though we now have the GameCube classics on the Switch too, I doubt due to its unique controls that we'll ever see it brought to the service unless it gets some major changes due to its control scheme. But regardless of its dire and forgotten history, I feel like this title is just as worthy as the rest of them, and it's one of many high quality 2D platformers Nintendo has put out which is full of charm and personality. It's an interesting footnote in Donkey Kong's history of being many different things, and who knows, in a post-Bonanza world maybe we'll see it return again in some shape or form. It really has been an unpredictable journey following this series over the years. But with all that out of the way, now I'm curious, have you ever played Donkey Kong Jungle Beat before? Feel free to let me know about it in the comment section. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.